What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here with the 2-hour Megamix. It's 2 hours of new true scary stories to this channel, as well as I can keep track of. If you guys end up enjoying this long 2-hour video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, as it really helps the video and the channel to do better and ensure I can keep making these videos, and especially these long ones, for a long time to come. Also, just want to quickly remind you guys that this week we are back to the normal schedule. So for the 6 days of the week, it will be new true scary stories, and on Sunday, that is the compilation of all the stories read previously that week. Let me know in the comments if you guys have any thoughts about the stories in this video. As you know, I always love reading your guys' comments, even if I don't always have the time to respond with recording and everything. And I will see you guys again at the end of the video. Thanks for watching. This story happened when I was 12 years old. I'm a woman and 25 now. The story I'm about to tell you might not be as scary as some others you may have heard before, but for me and my parents, it was a nightmare. I remember it was a Saturday night at around 9 or 10 p.m. during the summertime. I owned one dog at the time, and his name was Benny. My parents decided that night that they felt like going for a walk around the block with Benny, and asked me whether or not I wanted to join them. I said no. I wanted to play some games on my PC. My parents were okay with leaving me alone for a little bit, since they wouldn't take any longer than 20 minutes tops. My parents got dressed and left the house, and I logged into PWI, or Perfect World International. I looked around in my guild and global chat to see if anyone was on. For whatever reason, no one appeared to be playing at that moment. I decided to go and join my parents since nobody else was online. I got dressed up and ran out after them. They weren't that far away yet. We all met up together and went to leave. I'd like to mention that I lived in an apartment building that had 10 floors, and we lived on the very first one. You had the basement of the building and then the first row of apartments. Basically, right as you enter, you're already facing them. I lived in the very first one. I always remember really hating that, because whenever someone would pass by our door, we would hear them at any time of day or night. Whoever was lurking in the night, you could hear whatever they were doing. It was somewhat eerie. Anyway, we got on our way. Our door had 3 keyholes and a steel bar that would block the door from the inside. The bar covered half the door. Precautions were my father's obsession. We exited the area around our building and enjoyed our walk for about 15 minutes or so. We realized that the wind was changing, though, from a warm summer breeze to an incoming storm. My mother made the call to go back home, as Benny had already done all of his duties. We opened the building door and went to our apartment and attempted to open it. My father unlocked the first 3 locks and then attempted to unlock the metal bar that held the door closed. At that moment, my father paused and turned around to us with the most serious face I'd ever seen. He whispered to call the police and ring the neighbor's door. My mom went to the second apartment, and the neighbor Ted came out asking what happened. My dad whispered to him, covering the peephole of the door, "Someone's in the house. They're holding the door right now." He told our neighbor to stay with us and that he was going to attempt to open it. After that, I saw my father rush by himself around the corner back to our apartment. Because we didn't have a street light on the side of our apartment facing the block garden, my dad was running off into darkness. I snuck outside too, waiting to hear if he got into any trouble. He's my dad, don't judge me. As soon as I got out there, I could hear him yelling, "Hey, who the hell do you think you are? I'm calling the police!" At the same time, I saw the rest of my family entering Ted's apartment. Eventually, we went back inside our own apartment. In just the 15 minutes while we were walking home, They had made a complete mess of our home. All of our shelves and wardrobes had been pulled out, and our clothes were scattered all over. Benny's dry food was scattered all over the floor. What scared me the most, though, was how organized they were. I say that because after seeing the disaster that was left behind, we knew it was impossible for just one person to hold the door and do all of this. The thieves had placed everything they wanted to steal neatly packed and ready in our living room. They'd placed our laptops, one of our TVs, my father's collection of coins, our phones, our wallets, even my father's camera. We came home before they had enough time to grab all of it, so they just settled with taking some of my mom's jewelry and some pocket money. After seeing this, for some reason, my silly child mind told me to rush to my room and check on my piggy bank. I always saved up money from whatever chores I did. It wasn't much, but it was my work and savings at that time. When I entered the room, I saw the bars covering my windows had been cut open, and my window was broken as well. That was how they'd entered. They came in through my room. My room is the only room facing the side of the building, and the one most secluded from view. Needless to say, I never felt safe in my own room again, which I had to live in for the next 10 years of my life. When the police arrived, they started throwing this white dust around. I guess it was fingerprint dust, though. They took pictures and took our statements. They were unable to catch the home invaders, but they were able to tell that this was an invasion, not the only one in our neighborhood either. During that month, many other homes had been broken into, one of them even being a home of a cop. They told us the attackers analyzed their victims and learned their schedules. They always knew where the children's rooms were and seemed to always enter through the children's windows. All of the families they attacked had children. It seemed they didn't expect us to return so soon and panicked, hence one of them holding the door closed with his body so the others could flee. One of those people was who my dad was shouting at, probably the one holding the door escaping last through my broken window. I don't know what would have happened to me if I didn't change my mind and give up on playing games. I probably would have come face to face with these invaders. I'm happy I didn't, though, and I hope to God that I never have to meet with them. How's it going there, eh? My name is Brett, and I'm a proud Canadian. I live in Vancouver currently, but I grew up in the Northwest Territories. To give you an idea of how secluded the entire area is, the biggest city out there is Yellowknife, which has a population of about 20,000. We lived in a house on the outskirts of the city. To get to our place, there was an unmarked dirt road that you had to take off the highway for about a mile or so before you reached the clearing where our house was. Now, when I say our property was surrounded by forest, I sincerely mean it. The forest that surrounded our home was said to be larger than the entire United Kingdom. Miles upon miles of trees and bushes, plenty of places to hide a body out there. We moved out there when I was about 7 years old, back in 1994. It would be another 2 years before my little brother Jerry was born. I vividly remember those days, playing outside alone with my dog Jack. He was a golden retriever, and he'd often accompany me whenever I decided to venture off into the forest, or when my dad and I would go fishing in the nearby river. Anyway, this story happened in the summer of 1995. Jack and I were walking on the trail behind our house. I had hiked on this trail before, but I'd never gone too far in. About 5 minutes into the walk, Jack began acting very strangely and started growling intensely. "What's wrong, boy?" I asked him. Jack gave me a pitiful look and then took off back toward the house. "Jack, get back here!" I called, but it was useless. Soon he vanished from view. I thought that maybe Jack wasn't feeling well or something. Again, I was 7 years old, and I didn't take this as a warning sign. I continued down the trail. After a few more minutes, though, I decided to turn around. I didn't want to go in too far without Jack to accompany me. I picked up a stick and drew a big X into the ground, thinking that when I came back, I would know exactly how far I had gone before stopping. I turned around, and that's when I saw something very unusual. About 20 yards away from the trail, hidden amongst the trees, was a girl about my age. She had long, dark hair that was covering her face, and she was wearing a long white and blue dress. Hello, who are you?" The girl didn't respond. She pointed to the ground beside her before skipping off into the forest. I just stood there completely stunned. We were the only family who lived out here. In all of my time living there, I had never seen anyone roaming the forest, not even one time. At the time, I wasn't that scared. I was more confused than anything. I snapped out of my trance and approached the spot where I had seen the girl. What had she been pointing at? I knelt down and brushed away some dead leaves, and that's when I saw what looked like a shoe sticking out of the ground. With my hands, I began digging until I could pull it out. It was an old sneaker, definitely child size. Here's what was going through my head at the time. Maybe the girl lost a pair of shoes while she was out here, and if I found them, I could take them back to my mom, and we could figure out who that girl was and give them back to her. I thought I might find another shoe if I dug a little deeper, so I stood over the tiny hole I had made and began clearing away a bit more dirt. My hands felt something solid. Thinking it had to be a second shoe, I started digging around it. Whatever it was, it definitely wasn't shaped like a shoe, though. I cleared the last layer of dirt over this object, and what I saw made me stop in my tracks. I got up and backed away as I looked down at a pair of hollow eye sockets that stared up at me from the dirt. I had just unearthed a human skull. I ran back to my house, crying my eyes out. I immediately ran to my mother, who was in the kitchen, and told her what I'd seen. She didn't believe me at first, but said she would tell my dad as soon as he got back from work. The next day, I showed my father where I had seen the girl. I stayed on the trail while he checked out the hole I had dug. After taking a look, he walked back and said we had to go back home right now and call the police. About 2 hours later, several police cars pulled into our driveway. They didn't tell me at the time, but I would find out years later that they dug up from that spot the skeletal remains of a girl who'd been missing for over 15 years. I told my parents and the officer I spoke to about the girl I'd seen in the woods that day, but everyone dismissed my claims as just my imagination. It's normal for kids to embellish the truth sometimes. I swore that this was not one of those times, though. I wouldn't have started digging at that spot if it wasn't for the girl I'd seen pointing to it. I don't know what happened that day, but I believe personally that what I saw was her spirit waiting for someone to discover her remains. Finally, after 15 years, her family could have some closure. I'm a woman and was 15 at the time of this experience. One night, my 2 sisters and I wanted to stay up and have some fun. We set up camp in the living room. I got the reclining chair while my 7-year-old sister Amelia slept on an air mattress on the floor. My older sister Claire, who was 20, slept on the couch. We all chatted about drama, school, boys, and other stuff like that. We did stay up pretty late, but one by one, we all eventually fell asleep. I was woken up sometime later, and I didn't know why. That is, until I heard it. A soft tapping sound coming from the window. I looked over, and the curtains were drawn. The chair I was resting on, though, was positioned in such a way that I could see through the gap in the curtains. I could see someone standing just outside. They suddenly crouched down, and I caught a glimpse of an eye looking right at me. I'm still not sure if they could see me because of the poor lighting inside, but I was really freaking out. The person stopped tapping and just stood there looking in through the gap in the curtains. I couldn't tell you what this person looked like. Most of their features were obscured. I slowly turned over and covered myself up with a blanket. I thought it must have been one of our sketchy neighbors or a peeping Tom, and that they would eventually go away. As I laid there facing the wall, though, there came a louder banging. I turned back to the window, and I saw the shadow of the person still standing there. Now, though, they were fully slamming their fists against the window's surface. They were not trying to be stealthy whatsoever. I hate to say it, but I just kinda froze up. That is, until I heard Amelia moving around on the mattress. Shortly after, she began crying as she saw the figure standing outside the window. The protective big sister inside me snapped me out of my trance. I tossed my blanket to the side and got up as quickly as I could. I knew that if the intruder managed to break the glass, my little sister would be in the crossfire. I picked her up and ran to the couch that Claire was sleeping on. Unfortunately, it was up against the very same wall as the window. Now Amelia was crying even harder. My sister Claire suffers from a sleep disorder that she inherited from my father. Both of them have to take sleeping pills, which means that once they pass out, it's next to impossible to wake them up. Given the circumstances, though, I tried anyway. I could hear Claire mumbling something in her sleep. I tugged on her hair until I practically yanked her halfway off the couch. I heard the sounds of the window starting to crack. Our glass was thick, but it was still possible to break it with enough force. I tried one last desperate attempt to get Claire to wake up, but then the unthinkable happened. The glass shattered, and the intruder hurled himself in through the window, crash landing on the living room floor. Amelia and I backed away as the figure slowly got up to his feet. He then turned his head towards us. I could not make out his face, but I could tell there were several pieces of shattered glass sticking out of his cheek and neck. He landed right on top of a bunch of shards. I felt shitty for leaving Claire behind, but I had to think about my little sister. We ran to the basement, which was not the best place to hide, but I was in full-on panic mode. We went to the back of the basement and hid behind a half wall that separated the room into two sections. We heard shuffling sounds from upstairs before all went silent. After a few moments, we heard sirens in the distance. A few minutes later, two cops opened the basement door. Claire had been injured by the broken glass, but otherwise she was okay. The intruder unfortunately managed to slip away before the cops arrived. I have a feeling it was one of our neighbors, or at least someone that was staying at one of their houses. Otherwise, how could a guy who had glass sticking out of him that had just thrown himself through a window be hard to miss on patrol? It turned out somebody else from further up the street had seen someone suspicious walking down the road and decided to call the cops earlier. They chose our house out of all of them. To this day, whoever it was has still never been caught. This took place in my small hometown in Texas, which isn't too far away from Austin. It happened when I was about 5 years old. This was back in the early 80s, and crime in our town was slim to none. It wasn't uncommon for kids to wait in the car while our parents went into the grocery store or gas station. Those were different times. My parents drove around a Buick LeSabre from the 1970s. It was cream-colored, two-door with a brown vinyl top, very old school. One day, my mother and I took a trip to the grocery store. My big brother decided to stay home and play video games, and looking back, I wish I would have stayed with him. When we got to the store, I decided to wait in the car. My mom lowered the windows a little more than halfway down before she left. If you're unfamiliar with two-door model cars from the 70s era, they had enormous windows. It wasn't summer yet, so I was comfortable with the outside temperature. I was sitting in the front passenger seat, and I don't know how much time had gone by. It wasn't long, though, before a small red truck hauling a camper pulled right up on my side. Instead of getting out and going inside, the driver just sat there and kept looking at me, then all around the parking lot, then back at me. I wanted to roll up the windows, but I didn't have the keys. Fortunately for me, there were some people out and about, but it seemed this man wasn't going to give up so easily. He opened his door and climbed out of his cab, still looking right at me. He began to move toward me, scanning the parking lot again and again. By this point, every alarm bell was going off in my head. I crawled into the back seat to put as much distance between him and I as possible. If he was going to break into the car and snatch me up, I wanted to make it as difficult for him as I could. Hopefully someone would see him, though, and intervene. Not bad thinking for a 5-year-old. My heart was pounding. I knew that either one of two things was going to happen. This man was going to get me, or I was going to get away. Even with the windows more than halfway down, I knew it would be a real struggle for him to try and pull me through them. If he managed to unlock the door and open it, I decided I would try and escape through the opposite door. As soon as the man reached the passenger window, I saw my mom emerging from the store. I opened the door and bolted toward her. As soon as I got to her, I saw the truck hauling ass out of the parking lot. If it hadn't been for my mom showing up when she did, or those cheesy educational videos about stranger danger that they showed at my school, I may not have made it. I may have been just a kid back then, but I knew what that guy was up to. From that day, I never waited alone in the car again. That experience made me super aware when I had my own daughter. Some people might call me overprotective, but you just can't take any chances in today's world. There are only a few moments in your life that will shake you to your core, leaving you completely traumatized. This story is one of such occurrences. This took place in my home country of India in the winter of 2020. I was 19 years old. Due to ongoing lockdowns that were happening at the time, some of my close friends and I decided to meet up for a small party. After discussing it with the group, we agreed that the party would be held at my best friend's house. Her name is Anita, by the way. Anita's mother welcomed us with dinner and a bottle of wine for a Christmassy sort of celebration. Later on, we were watching a movie, having a pretty good time, but Anita's inebriation was becoming noticeable. How could just a small amount of wine do that? She must have been a major lightweight, I thought. Turns out that each time she went to the bathroom, she had been secretly drinking some rum she had kept hidden away. I guess she didn't want to share with the rest of us. After a while, Anita got a call from her boyfriend and went out to the balcony to talk. Even with the movie sounds, we could hear her cursing violently about something. She then stumbled back into the room. We all looked at her a bit worried. Anita seemed to be staring at me with a certain look that could almost be described as hatred. A moment later, that look vanished, and she smiled as happy as ever. "Is everything okay, Anita?" "Oh, it's nothing. My boyfriend was supposed to meet me tomorrow, but turns out he won't be able to make it." "Oh, that's too bad. Why don't you come watch the rest of the movie with us?" As we watched the movie, though, I saw that out of the corner of my eye, Anita was staring at me with the most hateful look possible. I concluded that it must just be a consequence of her being severely drunk. Oh boy, was I wrong. After the movie, she requested that I stay over, since I was her best friend. The others all left, and now it was just me and Anita. After some girly conversations, we both went to bed. I don't know how long I'd been sleeping for, but suddenly I woke up to a searing pain in the left side of my chest. For a moment, I thought I was having a heart attack. I felt my chest, though, and I soon realized exactly what had just happened. I was bleeding. I had been stabbed in the chest. Before I could even scream, she clamped my mouth shut and started whispering in my ear, "My piece of shit boyfriend has a thing for you. I hate you so much." She raised the knife in her hand for a second time, but this time I blocked it with my own hand. That resulted in her stabbing right through my left palm. Thankfully, I was much bigger than Anita, so I pushed her off me with all the strength I could muster and screamed at the top of my lungs. There was a big struggle, but I was able to relatively subdue her. By that time, her parents were banging on the door. Her father eventually kicked it in and switched on the light. They froze in confusion and horror after they saw me covered in blood and bleeding profusely. As we waited for the police and ambulance and my parents to come, Anita became completely insane. She began screaming at me and saying she was going to finish the job. Unbeknownst to me, Anita was diagnosed with schizophrenia and had to be placed on strong medications. In India, mental disorders are still a taboo topic, so many of her family members never told anyone about her condition, which is severely irresponsible. She was not convicted of a crime because of her mental condition, but she was sent to an institution for treatment. As for me, the knife missed my heart by only a few inches. I had to stay in the hospital for weeks. It took me 2 months to fully recover. I still get nightmares about what happened that night, and I've never gone to a sleepover since then. This didn't happen to me. This is my mother's experience. I'll give you some background before we get into the incident. My mother was 11 years old at the time, living in the same bedroom that I currently live in. Our house is very old, by the way, and located in a very secluded area. The nearest neighbor is at least 5 miles away. The bedroom faces the backyard, which is inaccessible from the front yard unless you scale a metal fence. Now on to the night in question. I'll tell the rest of the story from my mother's perspective. One night, at about 2 a.m., I was sleeping in my bedroom when I was woken up by the sound of scratching on my window. It sounded like the branches from a nearby tree were rubbing up against the screen of it. I tried to just ignore it, but the noise persisted and kept happening in intervals, with about 10 seconds in between them. As I began to wake up fully, I realized something very unsettling. There were no trees or bushes by my window. There were some along the other side of my home, but not where my room was. That's when I decided to get out of bed and take a look at what was going on here. I stood there listening, terrified to discover what was behind the blinds. I gathered up as much courage as possible and yanked the blinds back. A tall figure stood on the other side, wearing a Jason Voorhees hockey mask. I was frozen in fear. I noticed the knife in the man's hand, which is what he had been rubbing up against the screen. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, before suddenly the man turned around and ran away, vanishing into the forest. Once I snapped out of my shocked trance, I screamed bloody murder and ran to go get my father. He ran outside with a shotgun and tried to find the man, but he was obviously long gone. I still have no idea if it was just a prank or if this guy planned on entering the home and lost his nerve once he saw me. Keep in mind, our house is in the middle of nowhere, so the implication is that either some lunatic was wandering around the forest in a hockey mask, or someone had traveled a very, very long distance just to play a prank and run away. Needless to say, this shook us up for quite a while. If someone was indeed watching our house, there were plenty of places for them to hide and scope us out. Thankfully, though, nothing like that ever happened again. My name is Riley. I'm 17 now, but this story happened when I was 9 years old. I was on a camping trip with my sister Lynn, who was 10, and my cousin Joanne, who was also 9. My grandparents were real camping enthusiasts, so they wanted to take us all on our first camping trip. I had very bad separation anxiety from my mom when I was growing up, and this was my first time going somewhere without her. I wasn't exactly too happy about the entire thing. Luckily, we were only going to be gone for 3 days. The site had about 150 lots to set up camp at. The day we got there were about 15 of the lots taken up. We went there 2 weeks after school started, so it wasn't really that busy. The first night we got to the campground, Lynn, Joanne, and I went on a walk around the entire campsite, while our grandparents set up the trailer. On our walk, we saw a white kitten sitting on the gravel just looking up at us. We all tried to pet it, but it ran off down a side trail that we hadn't noticed before. We followed it, and it brought us to a small abandoned playground behind the trees. I'm not kidding you. It looked just like a site out of Silent Hill. There was a tall metal slide, 4 swings, and a jungle gym. 2 of those pig and horse seesaws, too. We didn't want to miss out on dinner, so we noted the eerie playground's location and returned to the camper. The next day, we went down to the lake and swam a bit until around 5 p.m. After we ate dinner, we were all sitting outside the camper, just chilling around. That's when Lynn popped up in her seat and said, "Hey, why don't we go check out that playground we saw yesterday?" Joanne and I thought it was a good idea. It was the perfect temperature out that night. Not too hot, but not too cold either. We put on our shoes and made our way to the old playground. It took us about 5 minutes to get halfway there, since this campground had long trails, and we weren't really in a big hurry. We all suddenly stopped. We saw that same white kitten sitting on the path. We got real quiet as to not scare it off, but then we heard a twig snap behind us. We all looked back to see a woman there. She had curly brown hair. We didn't feel like sticking around someone that we didn't know, so we kept walking without saying anything to her. I looked back every few minutes to see her following us. We ended up making it to the playground and hung out there for about an hour or so. We were on the swing sets, and there was a 6-foot fence on the back side of the playground with a lake on the other side. We were all enjoying the view of the water and sunset when we heard another twig breaking somewhere off in the forest. We all stopped swinging, trying to see if there was anyone nearby. I ended up looking toward the slide and saw that same person from earlier hiding underneath it. To say I was startled is an understatement. I told Lynn and Joanne that we should start heading back to the camper right now. It was getting quite dark out. I agreed, but I didn't mention the girl hiding under the slide. Once we walked down the trail and were heading back toward the camper area, I looked back one last time to see that same person standing at the edge of the forest and watching us. Once we got back to our camper, we didn't see anyone around the campsite. It was practically a ghost town. Once inside, we noticed our grandparents were nowhere to be found. We peeked out of the windows and realized that everything was dead quiet. There was no chatter from the other campers, there were no dogs barking, no kids running around. Everything was eerily silent. It was unsettling because at our young age, none of us had cell phones to call for help. We all just sat in our beds not saying anything. We were supposed to leave early the next morning, so we decided to call it a night, hoping our grandparents would show up at some point. When we all woke up, Lynn stepped outside to see if anyone was there, but just like the day before, there didn't seem to be anyone in sight. She came back inside and locked the door, and we all started crying, hoping this would all come to an end. We went on the whole day without leaving the trailer, and eventually went back to bed. I woke up some time later to hear a bunch of police sirens and people talking outside. I got up to see what was going on. I saw my mom getting out of a car, surrounded by at least 8 police cars. She instantly ran right up to me and hugged me. We were all confused about what was happening. Everyone told us our grandparents had gotten lost, but a few years later, when I got older, I discovered the truth about what happened. My grandparents and several other people on the camping site that day had disappeared without a trace. No one knows what happened to them. The police were notified by other family members when they didn't hear from their relatives at the campsite. I'm not sure why nothing happened to us that day. Whatever caused people to disappear must have occurred while we were away at that playground. The campsite's reputation obviously never recovered from that incident, and it ended up shutting down shortly after. The mystery of the vanishing campers has never been solved. Two weeks ago, I wanted to take a walk around town after I got off work. I had about an hour of sunlight left, and I wanted to be home to do some housework before it got dark. It was about at the midway point when I saw someone following me, a man wearing work gloves, sunglasses, and a ball cap. It didn't really concern me at first, because sometimes I would see other people during my walks, even around this time. It was still quite warm out though, so I thought it was strange that he was wearing so much. During my walks, I would sometimes take photos of the sky, or interesting tree formations, all that scenic kind of stuff. While I was snapping a photo of the evening sky, I noticed that the man had also stopped and was watching me as I took the picture. I tried to be positive and thought that perhaps he was also admiring the view or something. I continued on, but I deliberately slowed down. The man did the same, and I felt my heart begin to beat faster. I didn't want to panic though. The area I live in is quite rural, surrounded by forests on all sides. Plenty of places to ambush someone. But on the other hand, it was the kind of place where people left their bikes unlocked and their front doors wide open. It was refreshing for me when I first moved there, although since I arrived things changed. I'd noticed a lot of new faces showing up, like the man that happened to be following me on this night. It seems the more populated this place became, the more crime took place. I quickly made my way through a cluster of trees and burst out onto another street. I saw a few people out and about, so I felt a bit safer. I looked behind me, though, and saw the man walking through the trees, nonplussed about everything. Seeing him so calmly chasing after me frightened me, but I knew I needed to keep my composure and ask someone else for assistance. He continued to tail me as I went down a few side streets. Eventually, I stopped at a community pond. Soon, my pursuer emerged. There was no mistaking it. He didn't just happen to be walking down the same streets I was, and I was just being paranoid or something. He was specifically targeting me. I was on the other side of the pond as he approached. He never took his eyes off me. To my surprise, he took a seat on a park bench that was next to the pond. I was barely holding it together. I left the pond area, making sure I took another path to avoid the man. Soon, I found myself outside one of the only restaurants in town. During all the commotion, I had forgotten this place was nearby. I saw two women out walking their dogs, and I ran over to them and asked them for help. I explained everything to them. At that very point, the man came around the corner. When he spotted me, he casually strolled toward me. I stayed behind the two women, and one of them spoke directly to him. "Hey, are you bothering this woman? You better leave her alone, weirdo." The man didn't even try to interact. He simply walked right past us and disappeared down the street. Afterward, I accompanied the two women as they walked their dogs. Turned out they were going by my place anyways. I never did see that man around town again. I avoided going for walks around town after work for the remainder of my time there. There's no telling what would have happened to me if I hadn't been vigilant that night. What did he want from me? Why was he so calm and calculated? What did he plan on doing to me? These are all frightening thoughts that occupy my mind. I'm considering taking self-defense courses, just in case something like this ever happens again. Back in the mid-2000s, I had some pretty good luck doing odd jobs on Craigslist. They were mostly landscaping jobs that paid decently most of the time. My full-time gig allowed me a lot of free time, so this was a great way for me to make some side money and also be outside on a Monday. I answered an ad for a landscaping job on a Friday. I started communicating with a woman, and we eventually exchanged numbers. The way she was texting seemed almost flirtatious. Her name was Tracy, and after she told me about the job, she continued texting me, asking very probing questions. Stuff like, how big are your muscles? She would accompany all these messages with smiling emojis. At the time, being a single guy in my early 20s, I loved the attention. I have to say, I'm not the best at picking up signs, but I felt like it was obvious at this point that she was flirting with me. I started to roll the dice more with my messages back and try to see how far I could take the conversation without going over the line. It was becoming clear to me, though, that there was no line. We texted that entire night and continued texting the entire week. It was pretty crazy, I admit, but the weirdness of the situation was kind of exciting for me. In the middle of the week, the flirting evolved into something much more personal. She started sending me pictures of her posing in the kitchen. We started sharing details about ourselves. She told me she was divorced and now single. She said she was 37 years old. I loved the idea of talking to an older woman, just as she admitted that she loved talking to a younger guy. We texted non-stop for days, and we even made a plan for Friday night after the landscaping job was done. She told me that I could shower at her place, and let's just say she implied much more than showering. I'd never been more excited to do a job in my life, to be honest. On Friday morning, the day of the job, she texted me and said she would be at work when I got there, but everything I would need was in the backyard in the shed. After that text, I never got another message from her for the entire day, which was kind of weird. I'm not kidding when I tell you that I messaged this girl all day, every day since Monday, at all times of day, so not hearing from her at all was kind of strange. I messaged her a few times just to see how she was doing and see if we were still hanging out after the job, but I received no answer. I couldn't shake the thought that I'd been catfished all week. Some guy was probably messaging me, pretending to be a woman. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I was just about finished with all the work, and I hadn't heard from Tracy. I'd given up hope that she was even a real person at all. Not 5 minutes later, though, I felt a jolt of excitement. I saw a green sedan pulling into the driveway, and I couldn't believe my eyes. It was Tracy, the same person from all the pictures on my phone. I smiled, but she didn't even look at me. She just parked and went inside the house. I started walking over, and then this big white truck pulled in behind Tracy's car. The driver got out and aggressively stormed in. He was a huge man, very muscular, looked almost like a professional wrestler. I had no idea what was happening, but no matter what, I had to go inside so I could get paid for all this work I'd just done. The front door was open, and only the screen door was shut. I sort of shouted through the screen that I was finished with the work, and I was coming inside to meet Tracy for the payment. I entered the screen, and as I walked a few feet into the house, the man moved in behind me, standing in front of the screen door. Tracy emerged from the room in front of me, and in a completely hysterical voice she began screaming, "That's the guy, babe, that's the creep from Craigslist who won't leave me alone!" The giant guy started stepping toward me, cussing me out for hitting on his wife. I immediately went into self-defense mode. "Whoa, man, what are you talking about? She told me she was single. Got the messages to prove it right here." The guy paused for a moment, looking at me. I could hear Tracy shouting from behind me that I was a liar. The man started to get heated and began yelling at her too. Before I knew it, I was in the middle of an argument I didn't want to be in. Tracy continued to call me a liar, among many other things. At the same time, she was yelling at the large man. Tracy's husband effortlessly pushed me out of the way and made his way toward her. When he was just a few inches away, she pulled from behind her back one of those meat tenderizers, like a spiked mallet thing that some people might have in their kitchen. She struck the man in the head. It must have been a pretty good shot, because he fell over instantly. He tried to get up off his knees but couldn't. He just stood there clutching his head in pain. I shouted, asking if the man was okay, but he wasn't saying anything. I was so confused. I looked up and saw Tracy charging at me, mallet in hand. Without even thinking, I kicked at her ankle or something. At least I think so, because whatever I did caused her to fall down onto her face. While both these psychos were on the ground, I ran out of that home and drove off. I called the police, telling them everything that happened. From what I know, they did arrest Tracy that evening. I don't think the husband pressed charges, though. Though that man was not exactly a saint, he did eventually pay me for the work I did. In the end, I think I was an innocent victim of a very toxic relationship that hit a boiling point. In many ways, it's a good thing I was called there, and that I called the police when I did, because if I didn't, who knows what may have happened. Tracy or her husband could have done one another in, or even worse. I wonder what they could have done to somebody else if they had answered that ad instead of me. This happened a long time ago, in the late 1990s when I was 19. I moved from Oregon to Florida to be with my boyfriend at the time. Don't ever do that, by the way. I was thinking white sand beaches and Mickey Mouse, but instead I got the swamp, bugs, and dirt roads. It was such a huge shock to the system. We lived in a small town called Hawthorne, just outside of Gainesville. Don't ever go there, by the way. It was very small, had one stoplight and 4 stores, which were Dollar General, Steve's Market, Eckerd's Pharmacy, and Sonny's Barbecue. I got a job at the now defunct Eckerd's in the middle of town. It was right next to the grocery store, so everybody shopped there. After about 3 months or so of working there, I walked in to start my shift one day when the manager suddenly pulled me into his office. Laid out on his desk were 30 to 40 unopened letters, all addressed by hand to me. "Would you happen to know who's writing you all these letters?" I have no idea." "Here, why don't you read one?" I picked a cheerful-looking yellow one. Inside were 2 handwritten letters and a magazine cutout of a woman with blonde hair just like me. My manager watched on as I read the letter. I skipped around a lot out of confusion, trying to figure out why I was in this room right now. From what I could gather, It was mostly someone imagining what spending time with me would be like. A lot of it was, of course, sexual in nature. There were descriptions and comments about my hair, about washing it, smelling it. Something about moonlight as well. Some sentences were highlighted, while others were underlined. My first thought was, am I getting fired? My manager then asked me, do you know this David Elrod? Yeah, I think so. He's a regular who comes in a couple times a week to pick up some Diet Coke and medication for his mom. David was in his late 20s, a tall, lanky guy with thick glasses and frizzy blonde hair, obviously very socially awkward, possibly even mentally challenged. On rare occasions, he would attempt to make small talk as I rang up his soda. Once or twice, he would linger at the cash register or stare at me, but I figured he just had poor social skills. Harmless compared to some other people I'd met in Florida. I didn't really pay him any mind. That was until that day at the manager's office. I knew as soon as my manager asked that he must be the one writing all these letters. I remembered a strange encounter I'd had with him about 2 weeks prior while working. He'd come up behind me, grabbed my hair, and began to caress it. I had to remove it from his hands, and he apologized. It was weird, but no harm done, really. I went right back to work. After telling my manager this, he informed me the customer was going to be banned from the store. It was a strange day, to say the least. 2 hours after I got back home from my non-shift at work that day, there was a knock at the door. I looked out the window to see what resembled a full SWAT team. What the fuck? I saw men in tactical gear, brandishing weapons. There were 2 men dressed in suits, and several uniformed cops as well. In what seemed like slow motion at the time, I opened the door. An officer held up a few oddly familiar-looking letters. "Excuse me, can we come in and talk to you about these?" Realizing everyone in town must know about this by now, I felt so embarrassed. I just wanted to pass the fuck out. I didn't even know this guy. We sat on my couch, and the officer began to speak. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see my boyfriend shooting me dirty looks from the bedroom. The officer mentioned they got the letters from the pharmacy and were attempting to issue a trespassing notice against David. The officers had confronted him at his residence. Apparently, he was not happy about that. He insisted for over 45 minutes about how this was all just a big mistake, that I wanted this to happen. He was very combative and persistent. They were considering pursuing stalking charges. It turns out the story gets even more strange and horrifying. The officer continued. You need to be made aware of something. David killed his mother when he was 12 years old. He was released from a juvenile psychiatric facility less than 4 years ago, and we found some very disturbing materials at his home. We believe he's been following you for quite some time. His mom had been dead for years, and he was coming to my store and telling me he was picking up her medication. I remember he would often say that Diet Coke was his mom's favorite drink. David was arrested the next day for stalking after he was found lingering in the Eckerd's parking lot. The last thing I ever heard about him was that he was readmitted to the psychiatric hospital, at least temporarily. I didn't have a chance to read all the letters in full before they were entered into some vault of evidence. They never explained to me what exactly the nature was of the disturbing material they found in his home, so I never had the full scale of what exactly was happening to me. My boyfriend at the time was a huge dick about the whole thing, so I moved back to Oregon about a week later. Besides, who wants to hang around when Norman Bates in real life is so fixated on you? So, a little background here. My father was in the Army for 21 years. He retired and we moved to a very small town in central Florida. He got bored after a couple of years, and even though we didn't need the money between his retirement pension and my mom making what she did as a bookkeeper, He wanted to go back to work anyway. He started working at various gas stations, and with this being a small town, the owners didn't care if I came there and helped him out, stocking the coolers or even running the register, just as long as I didn't sell any beer or smokes. This took place in the year 1990. I remember the date well because it was shortly after my 15th birthday. I had just gotten my learner's permit. He would let me drive him to and from work, just to let me get some experience on the road both night and day. I was sitting at my usual spot at the table that was set up along the windows, reading a book with my feet propped up and a Mountain Dew nearby. I would generally spend most of the evenings that way, reading books and getting up to run the register every now and then. We were stocking the coolers at different times, and I remember glancing up because something caught my attention that seemed unusual. I realized a lady was walking up our parking lot from the direction of the interstate. The gas station was right on I-75. This in itself was very strange, because in this location, as you can imagine, we didn't get many people walking here. Definitely not walking from the direction of the interstate. I figured she must have broken down somewhere and was coming in to use the phone to call for a tow truck or something, but I was completely wrong. She came into the store and just kind of looked around for a few minutes. I remember getting this strange and creepy feeling about her. She walked up to the counter and started telling my dad a story. She had gotten stranded and needed a ride to the town just north of us. She was referring to Ocala. My dad let her know that he was working right now, and there was no way he could take her. She then turned to me and looked right at me. While she was looking away from my dad, he caught my eye and shook his head no. I was confused for a moment, but she turned back to him and pointed at me, asking if I could take her then. My dad cut in and said I only had a learner's permit and I wouldn't be able to drive her anywhere. Normally, I would have done it even though it was illegal, because I had done it a few times before already. I didn't argue with my dad though, since this was completely out of character for him. He was normally very chatty with customers, but for whatever reason, was curt and dismissive of this woman. It turns out he had a bad vibe the very moment he'd seen her walking up the drive. She cursed him out for a minute, and then he told her to get out of the store. She opened the door and stormed out. I thought the glass was going to break from just how hard she slammed it shut. She walked out of the store down the driveway, and I continued to watch as she made her way back up to the interstate, then up the northbound ramp. Almost a year later, I was in my bedroom. It was less than a week before my 16th birthday. I heard my dad yelling from the living room, "Son, get your ass in here and look at this." I quickly ran to the living room and saw my dad pointing at the TV. I looked at the mugshot of a lady on screen, and I remembered that lady who had been in the store. Turns out I had almost given a ride to Eileen Warnos, who was later convicted of being a serial murderer and then put to death. I still have nightmares about what could have happened if I had given her a ride. I'm a proud Floridian. At the time of this story in the early 2000s, I was going to college in South Florida, and I lived with my family in my hometown, located in the Panhandle. It's about a 7-hour drive up through Central Florida to get between my school and my home, so I mostly just went home for the holidays. It was the Thanksgiving of my junior year, and I was excited that I had been able to rearrange my midterms to be able to leave campus 3 days ahead of everyone else. I was expecting to beat the masses of traffic, and I was hoping for a quick trip back home. My roommates wanted to have one last meal together before we all left for break, so we met up at the campus dining hall around 4 p.m. or so. I set off on my journey at around 5:30. At 10 p.m., I was a little more than halfway there. I always stopped at this mom and pop kind of diner by the side of the highway to grab some food and use the restroom and call my dad and let him know I was okay. I didn't have a cell phone back then. Well, I hadn't been through here since summer, and unfortunately that place had gone out of business. I was bummed out that I wasn't going to be able to get any food. I just kept on going. There wasn't really much built up around there at the time. I saw signs for a rest stop, and of all places on God's green earth, some bumfuck town called Alachua. I went and parked directly under the streetlight for safety, and used the facilities to call my dad on the payphone. I didn't see anyone else there except for an exhausted-looking woman who asked me for some directions. She said she was with her husband and 2 small children, and they had made a wrong turn trying to get to Disney. Alachua is about 150 miles from Disney World. I left the rest area and was walking back to my car when I noticed a beat-up unmarked bluish-gray work van parked very close to the driver's side door. I thought to myself, yeah, okay, that's pretty weird. Of course, it had Florida tags on it, so it couldn't have been the lady I just talked to before. I distinctly remember she said she was from Virginia. I turned around and hightailed it back to the rest stop, promptly running into some middle-aged guy who had 2 little boys with him. Turns out that was his wife I had just spoken to before. She emerged from the bathroom about a second later, and I told the man what was going on with the mysterious van and how I didn't know what to do. He said he would go check it out. He left the kids with his wife and walked up to the driver's side door of the van. He stood there for a moment before speaking. His voice awkwardly quivered, but I could hear him yelling from where we were standing. "Excuse me, gentlemen, we've already called the police, so I'm going to have to politely suggest you get out of here." He ran back to us, grabbed his wife and kids, and pointed at me. "You, come on, let's get in the car right now." We all ran back to his car together. I was very confused, now sitting in the back seat of a stranger's SUV, while he went and used the payphone to call the police. Meanwhile, the van pulled out of there. I had never seen someone get the fuck out of a place quite like those guys got out of there that day. They ran up onto the curb on their way out and burned rubber. It was almost comical. The cops got there, and I found out what really happened. The man went to go check out the van, and he could see inside pretty well because I'd parked underneath the streetlight. The first thing he noticed was that all the seats except for the driver's seat had been removed. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat, and another guy hiding in the back with a tarp laid out, and a bunch of random tools back there. Neither of the men were reading a newspaper or a map or doing anything like that. Apparently, they were both just sitting there waiting for me to return to my car. Makes me sick just thinking about it. I really want to share one of the weirdest experiences in my life. It's something that isn't necessarily directly scary on the surface, but when you stop and think about it, it's truly unsettling. This took place before Instacart was a thing. One day, I happened to stumble upon this Craigslist ad posting for a gopher, essentially the same thing as Instacart. It was an old man who wanted someone to take his list and go grocery shopping for him since he couldn't move around very well anymore. I thought it was probably a scam, but I checked it out anyways. I was surprised that the job was legit. I did this for a few months, if not an entire year. It was a simple gig that didn't take me very long at all. I would drive down to the old man's house, grab his list and cash, and do his shopping for him. Without knowing anything about me, this old guy would just hand me his cash every week and trusted that I would return with exactly what he wanted. Lucky for him, I'm a pretty trustworthy guy. I would grab his groceries and he would pay me $200 when I would return. Easiest money I'd ever made in my entire life. One spring day, I showed up to the man's house on Tuesday afternoon, just like I'd done every week for a long time. The man seemed very tense though. much more so than usual. The man was grumpy and a little strange, but not really tense or paranoid. On this day, though, he kept checking out the windows and was frantically pacing around the house with his cane. I kept asking the man if he was alright, and he would just tell me to shut up and mind my own business. I swear I could hear him saying under his breath, "They're coming for me." I'm honestly not sure if that's what he was saying, though. It got to the point where I was practically begging him to just give me the list so I could go grab his stuff, but he was too distracted to do so. After 5 minutes of watching the man pace around, he finally shouted for me to come to the kitchen. All of a sudden, his demeanor had completely changed. He looked sad and regretful. In a very soft voice, he spoke to me. "You've been a good and kind helper over these past few months. When you come back, I'm gonna give you a bonus. You've become sorta like my best friend, kiddo." It made me sad to hear something like that. After dealing with this guy for as long as I had, it was clear he didn't have any family or friends. I soon forgot about that sadness when I started thinking about the bonus he had mentioned. I thanked him, grabbed the list, and made my way to the door. Just as I was about to leave, the man shouted for me to wait. I turned around, and as he limped down the hall, he extended his hand to me for a handshake. I smiled and shook his hand, and then left. The entire time I was at the store, I was trying to figure out what exactly was going on here. The man very clearly was not acting like himself, and his affectionate actions toward me were pretty out of character for this grumpy old guy. I spent 30 minutes at the store, and as I was turning onto the street where the old man lived, I was stopped by the police. They told me the road was now closed off. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were at least 10 cop cars outside the old man's home. I was hoping that maybe they were there for someone else's house, but the more I examined the scene, I could see that the cars were in the driveway of the old man. I tried to ask the police what was happening, but they ignored me for the most part. I pulled over and stood at the police barricade, trying to catch a glimpse of what was going on. While I was standing there, 2 cops were escorting the old man out of the house in handcuffs and placing him in the back of a squad car. I started to get more erratic and told the cops I was working for that old man and I needed to know what was going on. Instead of giving me any information, the police were more concerned with how I knew the old man in the first place. After some back and forth, I got nowhere with the police. To this day, I have no idea what the man did. When I looked up his name, nothing comes up, so clearly the old man had given me a fake name or something. What's really frustrating about this is that this is one of those cases that had virtually no coverage in my hometown. With all the excitement about gangs and things like that, some old man getting arrested really didn't make the news. I was telling a friend of mine the story recently, and he told me I could schedule a meeting with the police to find out who he was and what he'd done. I guess technically they have to give me that information, but honestly, I don't even know if that's true. I'm just going by what my friend told me at the time. At the time of writing this, I haven't followed through with that, and I haven't found out what he did either. Since then, I've tried to think back to those visits to his home, and anything about the house that could have given me a clue. The house was plain for the most part. There wasn't a lot of clutter, and it was mostly neat, other than that old man smell. This is horrible to say, but I'm pretty sure the old man is dead by now. What do you think he did? I just super overthink this, even though nothing directly happened to me. I still sit here and think about it to this day. I don't think I'll ever forget the image of that man being brought outside in handcuffs, with all those police around him. I got my first job when I was 15, and back then we barely made anything per hour. I think I started at $5 or something like that. I was working in customer service, which seemed like it would be relatively easy, but I knew instantly that I hated it. The customers were always rude and miserable to deal with most of the time. I did like getting a paycheck though, and it allowed me to get a cell phone and have some toss-around cash when hanging out with my friends. This was in the early days of things like Craigslist and Facebook, just as MySpace was winding down. Trying to find a better way to make some money, I started strolling Craigslist for new opportunities where I didn't have to deal directly with customers. It was pretty slim pickings. I called for a few landscaping jobs, but I never heard back. At one point, I stumbled across an ad looking for someone who could help with a summer cleanup of a few properties that were purchased adjacent to my neighborhood. The ad was pretty vague, I guess, and didn't mention much of the work that actually needed to be done. I sent in a response anyway, and the next morning I got a call asking if I could show up to work. I was ecstatic. I figured that if this worked out, I could kiss customer service goodbye, at least for that summer. I arrived at a property that was a little overgrown and a little shady from all the trees around. I walked to a door that I assumed was the front door and was eventually greeted by this guy who introduced himself as Chip. He had a smile almost like the Grinch, crooked yellow teeth, and absolutely rancid breath. It was honestly one of the worst things I've ever smelled. I can still see his smile in my mind to this day. Anyway, this guy Chip started giving me a tour of the grounds and outlined some of the work that needed to be done. Some outdoor maintenance, tree trimming, chopping wood. He wanted me to start with interior cleaning. I remember him taking me down a narrow flight of stairs into a basement. It was one room and completely square. The ceiling, floor, and walls were all wood. It was extremely dim and only gave off a small amount of yellow light. He gave me pledge or pine saw. I don't remember which one. I remember the product had a very strong smell. After attempting to clean the walls with it, I was either staining them or ruining them with how I was attempting to do so. I had chores all my life, so it's not like I was a novice to cleaning. This definitely wasn't the normal spray stuff my mom had for us at home to clean the woodwork. After what I think was about 2 hours of cleaning, I took a quick seat to wipe down the sweat from my head and take a sip of water. As I sat on the floor, I looked up the stairway that was barely illuminated. I thought I saw a dog or something laying at the top of the stairs. I wiped off my glasses and squinted up the stairs to see if I could make out what it was. I just couldn't do so from where I was. I got up and walked closer, and as I did, I saw it was that Chip guy laying down on the floor with a blank expression. As I got closer, I called out, "Is that you?" The blank stare immediately turned into a grotesque smile, and then he whispered something like, "Whoops, you caught me," followed by a quiet laugh. I decided to do some of the outdoors work, to not be in such an enclosed space. Everything was going fine, but I kept getting a weird feeling, recalling that very strange moment. Yes, it was extremely weird, and I probably should have just gotten out of there, but I was a teenage kid at the time, and I was a really big kid. I really didn't think I had too many worries. I was just here for the money. While I was outside, this Chip guy would be out there too, having a cigarette and staring at me. Or if he wasn't outside, every so often I would look at one of the windows, and the blinds would suddenly be moving. I started to pretend like I was looking the other way, but I had my eyes fixated on the window. I could see his head poking through the curtains looking at me, and what I was doing. The day was about half over, give or take. He asked if I could clean another basement, similar to the one I had done before. I didn't really want to. I was pretty freaked out the last time. I also felt like I was destroying this guy's wooden walls and floors with whatever it is he had given me. I followed him to where he said I needed to go anyway. As we got to the staircase, he stepped to the side and said something like, "There you go." This basement was completely pitch black. I could barely see the stairs I'd be walking down. I asked him if there was some light or something, because I couldn't see anything. He said unfortunately there was not, and went to say he had someone coming to install one. There would be a light when I got down there, though. To this day, I feel like he was breathing extremely heavily, and I could feel his hot breath hitting my neck and cheek. I took a few steps toward the stairs and felt his breathing suddenly stop. He was getting so excited and nervous. I quickly grabbed my phone like I was getting a call and took a few steps back. I headed toward the door to go outside and did a fake phone call. Chip stared at me with his hands on his hips. I looked at him and said, "Hey, I'm really sorry. I got a family emergency and I gotta go." He was passive-aggressive and short with me. I knew at that moment there was no chance in hell I was going back. I went back to my customer service job, where even though I had to deal with people's crap, it was pretty easy work and not quite so creepy. About halfway through the summer, I remember I was eating dinner in the living room after getting out of work while my parents were watching the news. I heard a report about a stalking incident, which also led to an attempted breaking and entering. I hated the news and thought nothing of it, but then I heard the anchor mention a name. It was that Chip guy's name. I immediately threw my plate down and asked them to turn it up. Sure enough, it was him. It was his complete full name, and I could not believe it. My parents asked why I was all of a sudden so interested in the news, and I gave them some stupid fake answer so I didn't make them worried. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I continued working with that Chip guy. He was clearly some type of predator, with those charges of stalking and breaking and entering. Anyways, I now work from home, so I don't have to deal with customers or any bosses that creep me out the way that guy did. When I was about 12, my great-uncle John came from Ukraine to visit us in Canada. He had a lot of stories to share, but this is the one that stood out the most to me. In the late 1960s, John was traveling by train from his village to another to visit family. He had to change trains at some point and was dropped off at what amounted to a platform and a hut in the middle of nowhere. There was no one else at the station. Other than a dirt road that led off into the surrounding forest, there was nothing around at all. He waited for some time, but his train didn't come. This was winter time, and it was getting colder and darker. Just about the time he started worrying about a place to stay and food to eat, an old woman suddenly appeared out of nowhere. She asked him if he was waiting for a train to come, and when he said yes, she said it wouldn't be along until the following day. She asked him if he needed a bed for the night and offered him a meal and a room at her home, which she said was about an hour's walk from the station. Lodging with locals was more or less the standard when traveling in this part of the USSR. Uncle John wasn't looking forward to a hungry night on a cold platform, so he graciously accepted her offer. He took his suitcase and they set off together down the dark road that led into the forest. It was more than an hour away, it turned out. More like 2, and by the time they arrived at the woman's small 2-story home, John was extremely exhausted and hungry. They went inside, and the woman lit up some oil lamps and warmed up some borscht for them. It was the first time that John was able to see the woman clearly. He was a bit startled to realize then that this woman was actually a man. Not wanting to pry and too tired to care really, John finished up his soup and asked where he would be sleeping. She led him up the stairs to a tiny room that only had a window and a single bed, nothing else at all. He thanked her and said goodnight, and she closed the door, locking it behind her. It left him in complete darkness. Somewhat creeped out by this, John called out to her, but she didn't answer. Hearing nothing else, he figured he would just deal with it in the morning. Maybe they'd done it by accident. John set his suitcase down and laid down on the bed, deciding that he would make the best of it. Before he could fall asleep, though, he felt the urge to pee. He got out of bed hoping to find a chamber pot or something that he could piss in, and got on his hands and knees. He began to feel under the bed in the darkness, thinking that if there was one, that was where it would be. Instead, he found a body. Uncle John stood up and went right to the window to see if he could exit the room that way. It had been nailed shut. He knew that if he remained in that room, he would be a dead man by morning. But if he broke that window and tried to escape, there was a chance that person would hear him. He did the only thing he could do. Pulled the body from under the bed, heaved it onto the mattress, and covered it with the blanket. He then got under the bed himself and waited. Sure enough, about an hour later, he heard footsteps slowly coming up the stairs and toward the room. The lock clicked, and the knob slowly turned. In the gloom, John saw someone moving toward the bed, and then he heard several sickening thuds. The assailant bashed the body with a large crowbar, which they then dropped right on the floor right in front of him. There was a silence, and the door then shut again. The footsteps descended back down the stairs. John moved out from under the bed, grabbed the crowbar, and was able to slowly pry the window open. He didn't say, but I imagine he was shitting bricks the entire time. When the window was up, he threw the suitcase out and dove through himself, not caring about what was below him. He was only worried about the monster inside that house. He landed without much injury and began to run into a field behind the home towards some lights. It turned out to be a highway with some military trucks on it. John was able to hitch a ride to another village, where he would then catch a train. He didn't bother reporting what happened to the authorities. At the time in the USSR, there was a distinct chance that he would have been the only one who got in trouble. He just thanked God he was able to escape with his life, and decided that the next time he traveled to visit relatives, he would take a different way. This happened 2 summers ago, while I was house-sitting out in California for an older couple I had met at a conference for work. It seemed like a dream scenario. The couple wanted to go vacationing in Hawaii for 2 weeks, but didn't want to board their cats. I've been chatting with them about wanting to visit California again. I loved it the first time I went, and we figured that we could mutually benefit one another if I came out and house sat for them. I flew out there, and they showed me around for a few days. They taught me how to care for their cats. There were 2 of them. One was extremely shy, and I barely ever saw them, which will be important later. They also showed me how to take care of their plants as well, and gave me access to their house and cars. These people were very generous. Before I knew it, I had dropped them off at the airport, and I was on my own. At first, it was a dream vacation. I was staying in Oakland and making forays into San Francisco, Sonoma, and Monterey. I was ultra content with the world. I was so enamored by the area that I actually started looking into taking some steps to relocate out there. One day, about halfway through my final week there, when I got back to the house this time, I felt very odd, almost like I shouldn't go back inside. I tried to shake it off and went inside anyway. Because it was getting late, I needed to feed the cats. Once I was inside, I forced myself to ignore this off feeling. I made myself some dinner and fed the cats, then went to bed. I was shocked to find that the shy cat was hiding underneath my bed and crying. This was the first time that I'd ever seen her up close the entire time I was staying there. She'd never once left the host's bedroom. Again, I ignored this weird feeling I had. I assumed she must have decided that I was okay to be around. Shortly after I went to bed, however, I decided to lock my bedroom door that night. I remember about halfway through it, I thought I could hear someone walking around in the gravel outside my window. After listening for a bit, though, I didn't seem to be hearing anything else. I went back to sleep. The morning after, I still felt a bit odd, but I kept up with my plans for the day. I drove out to a small music festival happening in Sonoma. I then went clothes shopping after. Overall, it had been a great day. When I got back to the house, though, I found the front door had been locked in such a way that I hadn't left it. Basically, my host never locked the deadbolt, only the lower locks. And that's the only locks my key worked on, so I never messed with the deadbolt at all. It was definitely locked this time, though. I had to call my host and find the hidden key, which, to their credit, safety-wise, was buried a whole foot underneath a bush outside. It most definitely had not been unearthed for quite some time. I used it to get inside. When I was in there, I kept the key with me just in case it happened again. It did, but with a different door. This time, I stepped out into the garage to grab something, and when I turned around to go back inside, the door was suddenly shut and locked. I could use my normal key on that door, but I was still pretty bewildered. I was trying to come up with some way the cats could be locking me out of the house or something, but I was coming up empty. I decided I simply didn't understand how the locks worked. I wrote it off and started double-checking whenever I left the house or went into the garage. That night when I went to bed, the awful feeling of unease was still there. So was the shy cat, who was clearly unhappy to see me but also refused to leave my room. I ended up locking my bedroom door and went to sleep. The next morning I felt awful. I was nauseous and my body was aching. I had no desire to leave the house that day. I decided to stay in and do some Netflix. This vacation stay was 2 full weeks, so I didn't feel like I was in a hurry to get all my touristy things in. As the day went on, I started feeling that wrongness again. It morphed into feeling incredibly watched somewhere around mid-afternoon. It got to the point where I was so uneasy feeling that I needed to get out of the house for a bit. I was getting low on food anyway, so I went to the local grocery store and bought a few items I thought wouldn't upset my stomach. As I started to leave the checkout, the cashier said a generic, "Have a great evening." I just instantly burst into tears, shocking both myself and the cashier. I just had this sudden intrusive thought that might be the last person to ever say something like that to me. When I got to the car, I was still crying, and my entire body didn't want me to drive back. How could I not, though? It's not like I could neglect those cats. I ended up driving back, parked in the driveway, and convinced myself after half an hour to just go open the front door. And once I did that, I thought I would get over it, and maybe go inside and at least feed the cats, maybe get a hotel room after or something. My body physically would not let me inside. It was like I was stuck in the entryway. I yelled into the house, saying that I'd already called the police and they were on their way. In panicked logic, I figured that if anyone was there, that would surely make them leave. The second I finished saying they were almost here, the light in the master bedroom turned on. I heard some banging and immediately hightailed it back to my car. I called the police for real and proceeded to have a mental breakdown while talking to the dispatcher. Once they got there, they checked the home but didn't find anyone. The double doors on my host's bedroom had been left wide open, and there was a pile of food wrappers in the corner behind the blinds. They said it looked like someone had been there. What makes this so scary is that nothing was taken. Additionally, from that bedroom was the perfect vantage point to see me in the living room as I was watching TV. The police told me there wasn't much else they could do. There were no signs of forced entry. We also couldn't get a hold of the homeowners right away. Later on, once they came back from Hawaii, they verified that nothing had been taken. Once the police left, that shy cat disappeared back into the master bedroom, and I didn't see her again until I left to go back home. I think the intruder had been there for at least 2 days, forcing the cat to choose between 2 strangers. I still had to stay in that house for the next 3 days, but nothing else odd happened, and I didn't feel that anything was off for the rest of my time there. The damage was already done, though. The situation messed me up pretty bad, especially since they never caught the person. Since that vacation, I've never felt completely safe in a home without doing a complete search before bed. I'm extremely glad I trusted my instincts. I guess I'd rather have some residual anxiety than be dead. I would like to share my experience with you all, as it was something that made me change into who I am today. Some info just before that though. I'm a Brazilian guy, 20 years old today, but I was around 12 or so when this story happened. Just a normal school day, boring subjects, annoying people, you know, the usual. I come from a good family with a somewhat good financial situation, so at the time I had with me a Motorola V3 cell phone. That was like top tier back in the day, and it was really uncommon for the other kids to have one. Every day after school, it would take a while for my father to pick me up with his car, which used to be a silver Mariva. That was also the same car he would drive me to school with. One day, I was waiting for my dad to come pick me up, so I was playing some new Super Mario Bros. On my DS, which of course I took to school with me. And that's when I heard my cell phone ring, and I heard the voice of a somewhat cheery man. "Hey Pete, it's your Uncle Paul. I'm here to pick you up for Dad. Come outside." I simply answered with okay and left through the gate. Thing is, it was still fairly early, way earlier than my dad usually picks me up. When I thought about that, I went back inside and waited for another call, and it came pretty fast. "Where are you?" the man asked. Yeah, I'm here, I don't see you." He breathed a heavy sigh and began to give me some instructions. "I'm with the same blue Corolla that I dropped you today in the morning, Pete. Come on." He hung up. He was getting impatient. My 12-year-old brain processed what was happening and connected the dots. The thing is, I had no uncles with a name that started with P. Also, it couldn't be my mom's brother either, because he'd been dead for quite a while now. No one called me Pete either but my family, being my brother, sister, and my parents. I started to get a bit nervous and talked to my friends about this. After all, some of them were still there. Basically, all they said was, "Yeah, dude, that's really sketch." Now, I'm not one to usually take charge myself, so instead I went to the principal for help. On the way there, the man called again, and I picked up. This time he was angry. "Why the fuck are you taking so long, you son of a bitch? Blue Corolla, are you brain dead? Get out here with that stupid video game of yours." Then he hung up. Instantly I froze, and many thoughts began to rush through my head. Is this a kidnapper or something? Is this a prank? I started running to the principal's office. I was getting nervous, so I called my dad. He answered in a hurry, and I took a deep breath to not seem scared. "Hey, Dad, did you by chance send someone named Paul here to pick me up?" My heart was pounding to hear what I wanted. "No. Whoever's calling you, don't go outside. I'll be right there." He hung up after. I went into the office building bursting in tears, asking for someone to get the man that was probably out there waiting for me in a blue Corolla. I gave the teacher and the principal the number he was calling me from, and they called as well to no avail. They decided to go outside together and check this blue Corolla by themselves. I stayed behind in the office as I got more calls. This time I picked up. My hands were shaking, but I knew at least now he could not harm me. "What's taking you so long, you little shit?" he screamed. "Listen, I know you're no uncle of mine. You have no idea which car I come to school in. You're trying to kidnap me or something. I'm not going out there." He whispered something quietly. I couldn't hear him, so I screamed and called him sick and crazy. "Again. You're not coming out again. You've been out. You just know better. Fuck you." He screamed before laughing like a maniac and hanging up. I held the phone in my hands and stared at nothingness for a while. The teacher and principal came back in saying there was no blue Corolla outside. Shortly after, my dad arrived, and I was escorted to a taxi with him and the guards. I sat there and did nothing, as my dad talked on the phone to track the number that had been calling and find this person by the name of Paul. I took the rest of the week off school, and eventually I started to have nightmares about being outside and being grabbed. After this all happened, I did go back the next week and instantly joined the kendo club in order to know something about self-defense, especially if I got the chance to be armed with something. Years later, my mom and dad divorced. I saw that coming though. After all, when this episode happened, I was living with my older brothers because they didn't want to involve me in all their fights. Once I came back home with my mom though, I found out they had divorced because my father had 5 lovers in 5 different places. Some of them had even tried to harass my mother. That made me wonder, could all of this kidnapping story have been a scheme from one of these lovers to steal my dad from us? If it was, that just makes me uncomfortable to know a human being is capable of killing someone's kid just to get what they want. Good thing is, I'm 20 today and I've never heard from that Paul again. I still wonder though what would have happened to me if I'd lapsed a bit and didn't have the knowledge to go back inside and kept looking for that person instead. From 2006 to 2008, I was a student at a university in England, studying paramedic science. This course was a 2-year fast track into becoming a qualified paramedic and EMT. The course involved placements at various points throughout both years. First, we spent an evening/night in a dispatcher's. I'll never forget some of those calls, like a man waking up in bed next to his wife only to find she died during the night. Next, we were stationed with the patient transport service, taking patients to their hospital appointments when they couldn't get there alone. And finally, after waiting a good 6 months for the opportunity, it was time to spend a prolonged placement with the 999 crews. You could choose a couple of preferred locations, and I was fortunate enough to be given the ambulance station close to my own home. Because of this, I moved back to my parents' home that winter for a full term, leaving my university buddies behind. In hindsight, I really wish I hadn't. The station was in Buxton, Derbyshire. Google Map it, it's middle of nowhere territory. It's also 45 minutes from the nearest hospital, so you better not get hurt badly up there. Only, of course, people did. So one evening, we respond to a call where a guy has come off his bike on the Cat and Fiddle Run. It's named after a pub by the same name on that road, which passes over the Pennines, a set of mountains. Bikers love to bomb it up and down. It's notorious. Guy broke a brick wall with his body. Legs were over his shoulders. We took him with blue lights to the aforementioned hospital, and I don't think he survived. This is where things got very messed up. We turn out of our hospital, travel maybe half a mile, and get flagged down by this pedestrian. She shouted through the window that somebody had been badly beaten. We later found out this was the case of somebody bumping into somebody else in a bar, nothing more. In that exact moment, a guy in a red shirt kinda stumbled out from a side street and collapsed into the road. I had been in the rear passenger seat of the patient compartment, with my mentor and her technician riding up front. They got out before me to help him, whilst I opened the side bay. Stupidly, I climbed out as my mentor helped him in. That's the point when I noticed 2 things. This man was not wearing a red t-shirt. He was topless and was saturated head to waist in his own blood. And now I realized there was a mob of people rushing straight towards us. 10, maybe even as many as 15. I can't exactly remember. I was still outside the ambulance and was pretty much frozen in terror. I was only 19 at this point and still kind of a pussy. Thankfully, my mentor hauled me inside and locked the doors instantly. She turned back to me, asking if the rear door was locked. It was not. They opened it from the outside. My mentor pushed them back, and I couldn't believe it. Started to heckle them, telling them to pick on a group of people and not just one man. She managed to kick them out and lock the door herself. What happened next will stick with me forever, clearly as I'm telling the story nearly 10 years on. The people surrounded us and began to try and flip the ambulance over. Meanwhile, another guy started hammering the side window. He shattered it and even cut himself wide open with blood spraying everywhere, but he kept on going. They were like animals. There was a window between the rear and the front cabin. We could see a police car fast approaching. He didn't stop though and continued straight past. I don't really blame him for not wanting to take on 15 people all by himself though. Only later did I find out that the keys were still in the ignition as well. Nobody attempted to enter the cabin through sheer luck. After a while, the violent hooligan mob dispersed, but not before leaving a lasting mark on my psyche. You ever have one of those older brothers who likes to pull mean pranks on you and tries to scare you to death? You know the type I'm talking about surely. The kind of brother who tries to convince you a monster is under your bed or the boogeyman lives inside your closet. Do you know anyone who had an older brother like that? Well, I didn't have one. I had a younger brother who was like that. My little brother Tommy was not only 3 years younger than me, but also a very tiny thing. Physically, he was not threatening in the least, but mentally, he had an imagination that could scare the shit out of people 3 or 4 times his age. The worst thing he ever tried to do to me happened when we lived in a house in a new subdivision. After we'd all moved in, all 4 of us kids got our own room for the first time in our lives. Being the second oldest, I got the second choice of bedrooms. The room that I picked was not only the second biggest, but also had another feature I really enjoyed. It was very unique to the other rooms in the house. There was this trap door in the closet that led underneath the house. It was actually kind of weird, but I thought it was really neat. This trap door led to what you might call a crawl space, I suppose. It wasn't really shallow enough that you would have to crawl in it though. A human being could very easily stand straight up and underneath the house with nary a problem. My brother Tommy just loved the idea of that trapdoor. He was actually quite mad at me for getting what he felt like was the most interesting feature in the entire house. About a month after we'd moved in, he was still trying to get me to trade rooms with him so he could have the trapdoor in his closet. After that month of refusing, I suppose he finally snapped and got angry with me. "Fine, if you don't want to trade rooms with me, then I'll leave you and Matilda alone," he told me. With that, Tommy turned and began to leave the room. Although I should have known better, I had to ask Tommy what the hell he was talking about. "I'm talking about Matilda," Tommy replied. "She's a homeless woman who lives in the crawl space. Actually, she was squatting in the house before we moved in. Once we showed up, she had to hide underneath. I figured I'd be nice and try to take this room off your hands since I'm not as big a chicken as you are. But I suppose if you want her, you can stay in the room where she has the most direct access to the house." With that, Tommy turned and swiftly left the room. I had to give it to my little brother, he had outdone himself this time. While this story did indeed give me the creeps though, I knew it was just his attempt to get me to trade bedrooms with him, and I was not about to give in. Well, Tommy didn't give in either. He began to taunt me on a daily basis about this Matilda lady. He described her as an ugly, fat old hag lady dressed in ratty blue dresses. He told me he would often talk to her, and she told him she would sneak up into the house when the family wasn't home to grab food. She would then take it back into the crawl space. She would cook it over an open fire. Tommy told me that he told Matilda how much he wanted my room, and once even asked her if she would help him get it from me. According to Tommy, she'd readily agreed she would help scare me out of the room, but she had to pick the time, not him. I supposed it was a brilliant tactic on the part of my brother. It really left it open-ended as to when this imaginary woman would come attack me. This was his attempt to keep me on edge all the time. My brother was very smart after all, like I told you. When I still didn't budge though, my brother stepped up his torment. He started doing something to me every night before bedtime. He would taunt me, singing about how she lived in the crawl space through my door. Even though I really didn't believe him, it did unnerve me as I laid there in bed. I would always sneak a glance over at that closet and that trap door. As I went to sleep, I heard the voice of my little brother in my head. as he whispered over and over about how she lived in the crawlspace. My brother's head games did begin to work, but I still didn't want to give in to him. In fact, it just had the opposite effect. I was even more determined to resist. It kinda made me mad he'd found such an effective way to get into my head. About a week after my brother had his little taunts, he came to my room again and was bugging me once more about Matilda. Right in the middle of his little game, though, we suddenly heard a noise. Tommy froze up and then slowly turned and looked over to the trap door. "What the hell?" he asked, fear appearing on his face for the first time maybe in his life. The moment he said it, I looked over and saw the trap door begin to lift up a bit. Tommy jumped, and I scrambled up onto my bed. "Holy shit, what the fuck?" Tommy screamed and jumped up with me. "Oh my god, that must be Matilda," I shouted. He looked at me confused. "Dude, what the hell are you talking about? You know I made that up just to get this room, right?" I looked over to Tommy, then back over to the now lifting trap door. "Well, then what the hell is that?" Before either of us could answer, the trap door banged again. Tommy ran to the other side of the bedroom and cowered in fear. My little brother, the king of horror, cowered away in the corner. "Tommy, I'm gonna go check it out, okay?" I told my little brother as I hopped off the bed. I slowly and cautiously began to walk over to the trap door. "Don't! I'm sorry I tried to scare you, but don't go over there!" I didn't listen. "You're my little brother and it's my job to protect you," I told him. "If someone's down there, I have to find out what's going on." Tommy actually began to cry as I approached the trap door. With every bit of caution, I leaned over. I slowly reached my hand out in order to grab the brass ring on top of the door and pull that trap door open. As I did so, the door was thrust open in my hands. A hand reached out and grasped my wrist. I began to scream, and as I did, the hand pulled onto me. It was holding me tight, and it would not let me go. Tommy was still screaming and crying, and started screaming for our parents to come help. Well, the noise and the commotion caused my parents to sprint into the room. They saw what was going on. My mom ran over to Tommy and held him tight. My dad came over and fully pulled open the trap door, revealing our older brother Joseph standing in the crawl space with a big dumb grin on his face. Holding my arm, my dad looked over to me and saw a grin on my face as well. Remember when I said I didn't have an older brother who would torment and scare me? Well, I didn't, but that night Tommy sure did. I recently moved to Colorado because I've always heard such stories about its beauty, and I've always been a really big fan of nature. Well, the fact that they legalized pot in the past few years really didn't hurt either, but that's kinda beside the point. I honestly had never seen the Rocky Mountains before, and I wanted to experience all the wonders of nature that John Denver was so ecstatic about that he had to write all those songs. Well, I wasn't disappointed. Colorado had a lot to appreciate. In addition to the mountains and forests and everything else, I also noticed that Colorado has a lot of tunnels as well. I mean, I suppose it does make sense. When you have so many mountains, you have to have a lot of tunnels too. I was particularly fascinated, however, with the train tunnels. Unlike car tunnels, train tunnels are not particularly well lit, and they're only really thin enough for the train to go through. There's a minor ledge on the side for a person to be up on just in case they're in there with the train, but other than that, there's really not much room. For some reason, I had become fascinated with these tunnels. I really wanted to try and walk through one of them, just to see what it would be like, you know? They were very old, looking like they had been constructed in the 19th century for all I knew. I just found them really fascinating. Now, before I go any further, I need to tell you what happens. This story has nothing to do with the actual train. I didn't accidentally go into the tunnel when a train was supposed to be coming, then run to the exit, only to just get out of there in the nick of time or something. Beforehand, I actually looked up the schedule online and was able to find a good period when there were no scheduled trains running for almost the entire day. That was the perfect time for me to go and explore. This tunnel I was going to was a particularly long one as well. Getting there was a little bit difficult even. Although there were no barriers, there was a lot of traffic on the interstate, and it went all throughout the mountains, of course. I was headed towards this tunnel in the middle of day, so I didn't have the cover of darkness to conceal me. I also wasn't brave enough to try and sneak into a tunnel at night. Instead, I put on an orange hazard vest. I wanted to at least try and make it look like I belonged there. I got to the tunnel without much incident, and held my breath as I went to venture in. It was really neat, and really light at first. As I mentioned though, this is a really long tunnel, and there isn't really much lighting in the middle. Once I was far enough away from the entrance, it was pitch dark. I had brought along a flashlight, but I sort of wanted to see how long I could walk before it got so dark I couldn't see anymore. As I started walking down the tunnel and into the mountain, the light behind me got dimmer and dimmer. I knew I had almost a day's worth of time, so I wasn't in a particular hurry. Eventually, after a bit of winding, I was in the pitch black. It was pretty awesome, I have to tell you. I took out my flashlight and shone it along as I went on. It was so dark that puny little beacon of light barely made an impact. As I continued walking in this silent darkness beside my footsteps, I heard a noise a bit off into the tunnel. It sounded like someone else was walking as well, but I doubted that could possibly be the case. I mean, what are the chances that someone else was walking this far into the train tunnel at the same time I was? Only a few moments later, though, I began to hear it again. It definitely sounded like some sort of footsteps, and it was coming from the direction I was walking toward. I wondered if this might be an animal or something. I began to get concerned. I didn't know all the wildlife that was in Colorado, and I was walking through a narrow tunnel deep into a mountain. It was not going to be easy to get away unless I was able to find a ring to turn me invisible. I considered turning around and going back because I kept hearing that sound over and over. As I stood there and tried to listen a bit closer, I began to hear what was definitely the clacking sound of shoes. It was coming from even deeper inside. I was in a bit of a quandary here. The ledge I was walking on was not particularly wide, so if I turned around and began to walk away out of the tunnel, I would be turning my back completely on what could potentially be a dangerous person. It would be very difficult to defend myself if I were to be attacked. If I kept walking forward though, I could simply be presenting myself to them. I really didn't know what to do now. I stood there waiting, feeling like time was going on and on. I heard the footsteps coming slowly closer and closer. I still wasn't sure what to do. Finally, I took my flashlight and tried to shine it deeper down into the tunnel. It took several moments to notice, but I finally saw a figure approaching through the darkness. It was a hunched-over person whose face looked very morose, with his eyes completely closed. He was a pale gray color, but I figured that might just be because of the darkness. I stood there frozen as he continued to get closer and closer. Eventually, he stopped in place, and then the most terrifying thing happened. He moved his head, and I realized that was not his head at all. He was holding what looked like a decapitated head in front of him. At least, there was a large bag that had a similar shape that he was holding. He smiled at me with his eyes still closed and called out, "Hey, you want to join my head collection?" I turned around and booked it out of that tunnel like you would not believe. I have no idea if the man tried to follow me, but even if he did, he was much smaller and older than I was. I really doubted he would be able to keep up. In that moment, I didn't particularly care either. I just ran and didn't stop until I not only reached the end of the tunnel, but sprinted through the opening, got to my car, and drove off onto the interstate. I really don't know what the hell that was, or how that man seemed to get a human head, but I know I'll never go wandering into train tunnels ever again. This isn't a particularly long story, but it is easily the scariest thing that's ever happened to me in my entire life. When I was a younger child, I was deathly afraid of the typical things. monsters in my closet, or something hiding underneath my bed. I would always have to check both of them before going to sleep, so much so that it became a daily routine. I would go over, open the closet door, have a good look around, and then close and latch it. Afterwards, I would go over, kneel down in front of my bed, and peer underneath. After I confirmed that there was nothing there, I would turn off the light and hurry over to my bed, which was placed up against the wall. I would keep myself against the wall until I fell asleep. Of course, I always felt silly in the morning and promised myself I would not do it again the next night. Regardless, when the next night rolled around, there again I would be. I was about 11 years old when, for the first time, I had a friend over to spend the night. My parents had this weird rule that we couldn't have friends stay overnight until we reached the age of 11. I don't really know why that specific age, but anyway, my friend Kevin and I watched some scary movies after my parents went to bed. When we were done, he went to my room. He put a big sleeping bag on the floor right next to my bed. It was a sleepover, so we weren't really planning on going to sleep just then. He laid down and started chatting as I was laying on my bed and he in his bag. Suddenly, he got up, went over, and turned out the light. I actually felt a bit of a jolt go through me because I hadn't expected him to do that. As Kevin got back into his bag and we continued to chat, I found that doing so had become somewhat strained. For the first time since I could remember, I was in my room in the dark without having checked either the closet or under the bed for intruders. Of course, the fact that we had watched scary movies really didn't help either. While we lay there in the dark talking, Kevin seemed to realize I was really tense. He made some bad gay joke that I was scared he was going to make a move on me, and we both laughed a bit together. I tried to relax for a while and keep chatting, but it wasn't long before Kevin had drifted off and stopped responding. Laying there awake and somewhat alone now was a bit frightening to me. I tried to just close my eyes and go to sleep, but it was too difficult. I knew I had to do my routine or I would not be getting any sleep that night. Of course, I couldn't turn the light on without Kevin waking up. I had a little book light on my nightstand though, so I grabbed it and moved out. I listened to Kevin's snores as I hopped off the bed very lightly. I crept over to the closet, making as little noise as I could. I turned the doorknob very slowly until I heard it click open. Opening it a bit, I shone the book light into it and confirmed it was indeed empty. I closed the door and made my way back over to the bed. I crawled up onto it because I figured I could just lean over and peer underneath. I took the light and slowly looked over the side, only to find myself looking into the eyes of a little boy hiding under my bed. I jumped in fright and dropped the book light on the floor. Kevin, of course, came out from underneath, laughing his ass off at me. Heaving from under the bed, he told me he was sorry, but he just couldn't resist when he'd woken up and saw me checking out the closet. He just had to try and scare me. I appreciated that. I mean, that's what male friends do to each other. Still, I asked him to turn the light on for me so I could calm down a little bit. He got up, went over to the light and flipped it on. When Kevin looked back at me though, he turned as white as a sheet. I followed his gaze toward the foot of my bed to see what had scared him. There was a little girl our age standing at the foot of the bed in a nightgown. I couldn't see her face for some reason. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "I'd like to play." The lights went out, and then when they came back on, she was just gone. Kevin stood there for a moment before asking if we could sleep in the same bed tonight. Yes was my only reasonable response. I'd woken up in the middle of the night, but I wasn't quite sure why yet. Not only did I work 12-hour shifts during the day, which obviously weared me out, but I was one of those really deep sleepers, even when my alarm clock would wake me up. It took me a little while to realize that it was indeed my alarm clock going off. Even then, I had a really hard time shaking the grogginess. After a few moments, I realized my daughter was standing on the side of my bed, trying to wake me up apparently. I fumbled around for my glasses, but I couldn't find where they were. Couldn't remember where I'd left them either. She was tugging on my sleeve, so I gave up finding them immediately. My wife was out of town, so I had the whole bed to myself. Somehow, I rolled all the way over onto the other side. I was so exhausted, I didn't want to do anything. I just gave up and asked my daughter what was wrong. "There's a ghost in my room," she told me, fear evident in her voice. If my wife had been home, she would have let her climb into bed with us. I, however, really didn't like that kids have to get over being scared of the dark. That was not going to happen if parents continued to baby them and indulge their fantasies about ghosts and monsters. "Sweetie, there's no such thing as ghosts," I told her. "You need to go back to bed. Daddy has to work in the morning and you can't go to school all tired either." "But there's a ghost in my room, I swear there is," I groaned. I didn't believe this sort of nonsense, and I wasn't happy my daughter was obviously believing it either. I rolled over and managed to pull myself up to a seated position. "Sweetheart, it's not true. Whatever's in your room is just your imagination. Now, go back to bed." My daughter stopped for a moment and seemed to think about what I just said to her. "Okay, Dad, could you at least check my room for me to make sure?" I supposed it would be the best way for me to get back to sleep. "If I check your room out, will you go back to bed?" "I promise," she told me. I humped up out of bed and went out of my room and into the hallway. I felt like I was almost drunk as I stumbled around. I was so exhausted I could barely even walk straight. The only thing I knew was that when I got back to bed, I might never wake up again with how tired I was. When we got to the room, my daughter jumped into bed and got under the blankets. "Check in the closet, please." Slowly, I made my way over. Grabbing the door, I rolled it open and looked inside. Of course, there was nothing there. I let her know this. She seemed very pleased. "Okay, check under the bed too. Will you go to bed right after I do?" I asked her. She promised, so I staggered over, grabbed the side of the bed to steady myself, and when I had the leverage I needed, I lowered myself down and peeked under the bed. Much like I had expected, there was nothing there. I was about to straighten myself back up when the grogginess started to clear up a little bit, and suddenly I realized something. My daughter had gone with my wife to visit her parents, and I was supposed to be in the house alone. I felt like my heart stopped as I thought back to that character now on the bed. I quickly jumped up to my feet, only to see that no one was there anymore. Nervous now and just a little bit scared, I jumped away. I half expected someone to reach out and grab my leg or something. Shakily, I made my way back to my bedroom. I turned all the lights on, because I'll admit, I was pretty scared. I repeated the same routine I'd done in my daughter's room. Checked under my bed, in the closet. I checked everywhere else as well. Nothing to be found. I slept with the light on that night. When my wife got home, I told her what had happened, and she got a pretty good chuckle out of making fun of me. Now, whenever my daughter comes to my room claiming she's seen a ghost or a monster, I just let her crawl into bed with me. What is up, guys? Blue Spooky here. Thank you guys so much for watching, especially if you made it this far to the end of the video. If you liked the video, please be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe if you feel so inclined. If you have any feedback for me as well, be sure to leave that in comments below the video. If you guys have a story you'd like to send in, or if you'd like to contact me for any reasons, there will be links to my social media in the description below the video, including my Facebook, Gmail, and Twitter accounts. Go ahead and send me a message on any of those, and I'll try to get to you as soon as possible. If you do decide to send in a story, please be sure to include in the tagline what the name of the story is if it has one, what type of story it is if it has one, and how you'd like to be credited in the description below the video. Please make sure to include as much detail as you feel comfortable with, and try to use as much proper grammar as possible to make sure you have the highest chance of appearing in a future video. Overall, I think that's pretty much it for now, guys, so thank you so much for watching, and I hope you guys have a great day.